We know based on just the narrative of the evolution of the Jewish people that the founding patriarch of the Jewish people was Avraham Avinu, Avraham, our patriarch. He's the founding father. When God appears to Yaakov or to Yitzchak, he says, I am the God of Avraham. When he appears to Yaakov, he says, I am the God of Avraham, I am the God of Yitzchak. When he appears to Moshe, I am the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, the God of Yitzchak, the God of Yaakov. So sequentially speaking, who is the first one mentioned? Avraham. Avraham is the founding father of the Jewish people. What exactly was the objective of Avraham? The objective of Avraham was to establish a platform which represents good at a level that it has the ability to counter evil. Avraham was able to advance himself to a level that based on his initiative, he was able to get the upper hand despite the failing of mankind with the tree of knowledge. Although we have that inborn Achilles heel, we have this genetic defect called evil inclination due to the eating of the tree of knowledge. Nevertheless, he has the ability to take full control and to negate it and to subordinate it. That was Avraham. Despite the world being pagan, Avraham was able to see the rays of light peeking through this tiny crevices of existence, and ultimately he magnified it. So the whole world should appreciate what he understood. And he spread the word. He espoused God's presence. Avraham himself, as we've been discussing the past 2 days, went into a kiln to die, not to behave as a pagan, not to bow to the idol. We say every morning in the Psukim de Zimra, which begins with Vayevorach David, Atuhu Hashem Elokim, Asher b'chata b'Avraham. You are God, the Almighty, who chose Avraham. V'otzisicho miur Kasdim. And you took him out of the kiln of Kasdim, v'samta shema Avraham. And because he went into the kiln, you took him out of there. And when you took him out of there to save him, you established him as not Avraham, but Avraham. The added letter. And you found his heart faithful to you. We say this every morning. So when was Avraham chosen to be God's representation in this existence? When he took him out of that kiln. Meaning because he went into the kiln to die for his glory. That's exactly why he was saved. For what purpose? To establish that platform of good in existence to counter evil. Until now, that platform didn't exist. There's no individual who had the ability to counter evil. Noah was given a chance. He failed. The world was destroyed. The world reverts back to its evil ways. Avraham now takes on the world single-handedly, but not initially. After he came out of the kiln, God gave him the ability to become Avraham. Who's Avraham? Avraham is the founding father of the Jewish people. When did Avraham become Avraham? We find that Sarah Imenu was barren. And all the years, Sarah believed that the reason why she was able to conceive was because she was barren. But there's nothing beyond God's ability. He could perform a miracle that she should conceive. Was it Sarah's problem or was it Avram's problem? Until a certain point, Sarah believed it was the deficiency lied by Sarah, our matriarch. But factually, that wasn't the case. The reason why Avram was not able to father a child was because he was deficient. He had the issue of impurity, and to be able to father the future patriarch of the Jewish people, he has to be purged of that impurity. When did that happen? When Avram was given the mitzvah of circumcision, which we call Bila, that's when he had the name change. There was a transition from Avram to Avraham. At that point, God says to him, you will have your son. You will have the son that will be the equivalent of the stars of the heaven. You will have the son that's the future of existence, who will address the objective of existence, to ultimately be the father of the Jewish people. Until he was circumcised, he was not qualified to have that son. So the transition from Avram to Avraham happened at time of circumcision. As Rashi himself in the beginning of this week's Parsha cites the Chazal that Avram numerically is 243. Avraham, you add 5, it's 248. When did he become that complete being? The 248 parts to a person's body. When would he take full control? That he dominated his physicality? Only when he became circumcised. That's what he hooked into the spiritual source at the most advanced level was at that moment. That's when the metamorphosis happened within him. And now you're qualified to father the future patriarch of the Jewish people, which ultimately will bring about the eternal people, the Jewish people. But Avram, till he was 99, he didn't realize this. He was Avram. He became Avraham through the circumcision. That's when he had the name change. But when did he achieve within himself that ultimately, when the moment comes, he will become that? This is when he came out of the kiln. You are the God who took Avram out of the kiln. The Samta Shema Avram. But it wasn't. The moment he came out of the kiln, he wasn't Avram yet. It was only when he was 99 years old. But then he was qualified that at the time when it was meant to happen, it's going to happen. But it's only because he demonstrated his unlimited sacrifice for God that he was even willing to die. Soon after that, he was told, leave your homeland, leave your birthplace, leave your family, go to the land which I will show you, which is Canaan. What does Canaan represent? The nations of Canaan. They symbolize and are the epitome of evil. They have their own brand of evil. Avram's progeny ultimately, when they will conquer that land, there's a mitzvah to annihilate, to destroy the 7 nations of Canaan. They have to be removed from that location. What is that location? It's God's location. It's Eretz HaKadosha. It's the Holy Land. So if you have the Holy Land, where there's not even an archangel that oversees that location, which every other location in existence has an archangel, that all the sustenance goes through that angel, and the Holy Land, which is Canaan, does not. So what is it? God's presence is there, and you have something which is disgraceful, which is a representation of the evil, which are the 7 nations of Canaan, they're at God's doorstep. They're more than in God's doorstep. They're in the inner sanctum of the palace. The Jewish people representing good have the ability, due to Avram's going into the kiln and coming out of the kiln, they were chosen to represent the good in existence. Now we have the struggle, good and evil. When we were admitted and allowed to go into Israel, we conquered the land. Part of the conquest was to destroy those nations. Because it's inappropriate they should be there. It's disgraceful to God that those nations are actually present in his presence. There's an interesting Sefarno. If the Jews wouldn't have sinned with the spies, we would have gone immediately into Canaan, into the promised land. But because when the spies came back, the 10 spies, and they came back with ominous reports, and the Jews accepted what they said, and they rejected Kalev and Yeshua's reports, which were overwhelmingly positive, God says, because what they saw, they rejected me. Despite that, this generation will not see the promised land. So the Jews who were less than 20 years old, who weren't deserving to be destroyed, were waylaid for 40 years until they were able to come in. Now, Canaan is evil. But what's the level of evil? Do they deserve to be destroyed? Maybe it's inappropriate they're in the Holy Land. They don't qualify to be in God's presence. Maybe it would have been enough just to remove them from the land. So Sefarno says if the Jews would have gone in immediately, the obligation would have been not to annihilate them, but just to remove them. But because the entry of the Jews was delayed for 40 years, during those 40 years, the Canaanite nations, they perpetrated and they advanced the level of evil to a point that it was not retractable. It was unforgivable. This is only due to the Jews failing. The members of the Canaanite nations sinned to a level that the only way to rectify their situations, you have to remove them. Meaning you have to destroy them. But if they wouldn't have, and they would have gone immediately, would have enough just to displace them. Where do we find something similar? We had mentioned that, as we'll read in a few moments, that when Avraham left Haran, he took his wife and his nephew and the people who he converted to monotheism had come with him. And his possessions from Haran. Now, Lot himself was the nephew of Avraham. They had a very serious fallout, the two of them. Avraham becomes very wealthy. Lot becomes wealthy. Now, once Lot feels he has his own financial independent ability, he rejects Avraham. He's an ingrate. Although all the wealth came only because of his uncle, nevertheless, he says to his uncle, don't tell me how to live my life. I'm not interested in your advice. I'm not interested in your God. I'm out of here. Where does he go? He goes to Sodom. There's no more evil location on earth than Sodom. But that's where he chooses to go. Where does one normally gravitate to? To the area that you feel you belong. So that Lot went to Sodom, it tells you volumes about who Lot was. Okay? Time passes, he's there. But before he went, his uncle, Avraham, had made a pact with him. That although we're parting our ways, if you go to the right, I go to the left, or vice versa, wherever you go, I'm on standby. If anything should happen to you, I will come to your aid, to your assistance. Then the Torah goes and gets involved. There was a world war, the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and the 5 kings rebelled against the 4, and the 4 kings destroy the 5 kings, or subdue them. And they intentionally take, and one of the kingdoms that was captured was Sodom. Who do you think was in Sodom? Avram's nephew. So what did these 4 kings do? They take Lot captive. Why was Lot such a valuable captive? Because these 4 kings, their objective was they represented evil on the most extreme level, including one of the kings was the king of Sodom. The whole idea was to bait Avraham by taking his nephew captive. They knew he would come to save him. And the way they understood Avraham, he's a fanatical extremist at a level of being irrational. He'll go to war against the 4 mightiest kings to regain possession of his nephew. And if that happens, they will kill him. And that was a ploy to take Avraham out by drawing him in and destroying him. But there was a surprise. Avraham was the victor. He destroyed the 4 mightiest kings. And the 4 kings that were captured, or at least Sodom, was taken back with his nephew. The king of Sodom was an evil man. And he says to Avraham, Tein li hanefesh v'chush kachloch. Give me the people. You could take the material spoils. The booty of Sodom you could take. All I want are my subjects, the people. Avraham responds, I will not take a thread of yours, not a bootstrap of yours. I don't want you should say you made me wealthy. If anybody makes me wealthy, it's God. But because you are such an evil man, you're going to attribute my wealth to yourself. I want nothing to do with you. But Avraham made a very great mistake. Although that may have been the case, but did Avraham not take the subjects of Sodom and take them as his booty, his spoils, and convert them to monotheism? If they're under the influences of the king of Sodom, there's no chance. He could have converted them. He did not. And the king of Sodom went back to Sodom. Lot went back to Sodom. So the Gemara tells us why did the Jews go to Egypt? To the bondage? As a punishment to Avraham, he had the ability to convert these people to monotheism. He did not. Therefore, your children are destined to be slaves in a land which is not theirs. They'll be enslaved, afflicted, and so on and so forth. They will become pagans then. Because you could have made these people who were pagans into monotheists. You did not. Your children will go into exile, into bondage. Now, at that point, evidently, they were redeemable. Because the claim against Avraham is you could have converted them. You could have converted them. And you did not. Therefore, you're going to be punished. But even if a person sins, what happens if you could rectify the wrong that you had made? So evidently, it's a way to extricate yourself from prosecution, from condemnation. Fast forward many years later, God comes to Avraham, I am destroying Sodom. This is news, hot news. Sodom will be destroyed. What does Avraham do? He enters into a dialogue with God. Maybe the 50 tzaddikim in these communities, on behalf of these 50 tzaddikim, throughout the right, you should save them. God says there are no 50 tzaddikim. Maybe they're 45. God says no, therefore. Maybe they're 40. Maybe they're 30. Maybe they're 20. God says no. Maybe they're 10. He says, no, they're all evil. What was Avram's objective to try to save Sodom? Avram's essence, his purpose, every fiber of his being was to espouse God's existence in the world. And here God says, what is your counterbalance? The evil that doesn't allow you to succeed, I will wipe them off the face of the earth. God should sing the praises of God. Thank God they're God. They're going to be God forever. But rather than saying that, what does he say? He wants to save them. How do you want to save them? They're your arch enemies. Whatever they are is the antithesis of what you are. So what's pushing Avram? What's the impetus for Avram to go so strongly to try to save them? What's going on? So the way I understand, very simple. Why are Avram's children going to exile, to bondage? Because you could have taken these people and converted them to monotheism. If God is saying now they're going to be destroyed, that means there's no hope to correct the past. But if Avram is able to save them through a supplication, and Avram now is able to influence them, he'll correct his original failing. And he makes that correction, the Jews are not going to exile. They're not going to Egypt. They're not going to be slaves. So what happened? God says, it's over. There's no hope for these people. So what happened? Originally, when he was the victor, at that point, he could have converted them. He could have, because that's the claim. You could have converted them. Why did you let them go? Years later, they're not convertible any longer. They've already reached a point of evil of no return. Avram now realizes, if that's the case, that's the final nail in the coffin of Avram. The Jews are going to Egypt. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to bondage. So what do we see? Initially, they could have been saved. They could have been influenced. But because Avram allowed it to go and time to pass, they've already reached a level of evil which is not retractable. The nations of Canaan, as we said, initially didn't have to be destroyed. In terms of what they represent, it's inappropriate. They should be in God's palace, in the location which is in God's presence. The obligation would have been just remove them from the land, not to annihilate them. But because the Jews were delayed 40 years in the desert, during that hiatus period, that delay period, they failed, they sinned to a greater degree. They went from bad to worse to the point of oblivion. Once they reached that point, now when we go into Canaan 40 years later, there's a mitzvah to annihilate them. Because now it's an evil which cannot be converted back to good. As a result of that, that be annihilated. So we find that the story of Canaan is a similar story as Sodom. Initially, they could have been influenced. They had the capacity. When they reach a certain level, it was beyond hope. Therefore, they have to be destroyed. That was Sodom. Canaan, identical. Literally a replication of the same thing. If you wouldn't have sinned, those nations would have continued to live elsewhere, not in Canaan, because that's God's land. That's in God's palace. But now that you've delayed 40 years, they're beyond hope. They're holding at the brink of oblivion. When they're at that level, the only way to deal with it, they have to be destroyed. That's what we see. But Avram had that ability. Because he came out of the kiln and he was chosen to be Avraham. Therefore, he's the founding father of the Jewish people. He actually established a power base of Kedusha, of holiness and goodness in the world. And because of that, the Jewish people had the ability to rise against the nations, to conquer them and to destroy them. Not only because we're a counterbalance, we talk about David and Goliath. Humanly, is it possible David could defeat Goliath. He's a giant. The nations of Canaan, they were a giant representation of evil, enormous representation. But the Jews, as much as they were, the Jews were still more. And if we actually functioned as we meant to function, we will destroy them. And they did destroy them for that reason. But where did they get that ability? It was due to Avraham. Because Avraham became Avraham, which is 248, which is the totality and the perfection of the human being, which indicates his spiritual core is secure. Therefore, it evolved into the Jewish people who at Sinai were given the Torah to become God's chosen people. So now you're representing me. When you represent God and you live a life as if you are representing God, there's nothing that could stand in your way. And therefore, we were given the order, annihilate them. A person that knows nothing about demolition, he doesn't even know how to use a hammer to hammer a nail. He said, demolish this building. What is he going to do with a hammer? With a screwdriver? You have to know something about how to remove a building. Remove these 7 nations of Canaan who personified and epitomize evil. It's not within our capacity. How do we do it? It is within your capacity. Because you descend from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and you have this overwhelming representation of good, and you have God's backing, nothing can stand in your way, even to destroy the most formidable opponents, which are the 7 nations of Canaan.